Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. The book by Peter Schmitz is now available. Order it at your local bookstore or through Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. Hello and welcome to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories about the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz, and our original theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. Join us as we continue our Season 4, The Rise of Modern Philadelphia Theater. In this episode, I want to cover 3 new theatrical spaces that came to define nonprofit and educational Philadelphia theater in the decade of the 1970s. One of these is by now quite familiar to all you longtime listeners of the podcast, the Walnut Street Theater, which would both be restored and also be utterly transformed at this point in its long and prestigious history. The 2 other theaters we're going to examine were new structures entirely. The late 60s modernist bulk of Tomlinson and Randall theaters at the Temple University campus in North Philadelphia, and its even more ambitious counterpart, the Annenberg Center on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia. It's been a while since I talked about Philadelphia theater in terms of the actual buildings that the plays take place in, but it's necessary that we do so because by 1960, the ideas of early 20th century European theatrical innovators like Adolph Appia and Edward Gordon Craig, with their many leveled open thrust stages enhanced by modern lighting and scenic effects, were rampant in the American theater world, and the study and awareness of world theater history was becoming widespread in America too, I'm glad to say. Directors and designers knew perfectly well that ancient Greek performance areas were not proscenium arches, but were usually surrounded on 3 sides by the audience. New research into the structure of Elizabethan-era playhouses, Japanese kabuki and no stages, and traditional Chinese opera were also intriguing theater makers with concepts of stages that thrust into the audience and that dispensed with the raising and lowering of stage curtains. These new stages would bring actors into more direct contact with the audience instead of always placing them within the artificial world framed by the proscenium arch. The first real progressive space in America, in fact, was done by the young Orson Welles at the Maxine Elliott Theater in New York in 1937, where he staged Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus for the WPA Theater Project with an added stage apron that reached way out into the house. By the 1950s, the Anglo-Irish director, Sir Tyrone Guthrie, and the designer Tanya Mosejewicz had commissioned the first real professional thrust stage built in North America at the Stratford Festival in Canada. And that pair would replicate this success in the next decade in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with a stage that is now named after its iconic director, the Guthrie Theater. Tyrone Guthrie also experimented with doing plays in the round, with the actors completely surrounded by the audience. Increasingly, stages like these were becoming the norm in modern-age theatrical practice. Either a thrust or arena staging became all the rage as the nonprofit regional theater movement spread across the country, and such stage configurations meshed well with modernist architectural principles, which valued open sight lines, sleek glass, steel, and concrete surfaces, and a general lack of ornamentation. Form followed function. As of 1968, though, Philadelphia had none of these spaces, although during the Circle and Square Company's brief foray into Philadelphia in the early 1950s, they had left behind for a while a simple wooden thrust stage inside the old ornate marble ballroom of the Academy of Music, and this was also the sort of stage that the TLA had tried to emulate when they converted that old movie theater on Philadelphia's South Street. But almost no completely new major theater had been built in central Philadelphia since the beginning of the Depression, a gap of almost 4 decades. buildings with both a new stage structure inside and also a new exterior, ones whose forms broke ground with the past. There is, of course, one notable exception, the Playhouse in the Park, the surprisingly lovely poured concrete modernist version of a summer stock tent theater, which was set on a hilltop on the west bank of the Schuylkill River in the late 1950s. But, as we detailed in our episode 53, as an institution, Playhouse in the Park was losing its political support from politicians and audience support amongst local theatergoers. And both audiences and funding would falter later in the 1970s. This was mostly due to City of Philadelphia budget cuts. The performing arts are always an easy item for the chopping block in hard times. The city expected generous and charitable local business owners to pick up the slack for the summer theater, which they did for a while, but eventually those funding sources began to die away, and after the 1979 season, the Playhouse in the Park was closed and remained closed for the next 2 decades when it was finally demolished. Still, some amazing events and shows did take place there. Before it all ended, I refer you to the chapter, The Show Rescued by a Helicopter, in my recent book. Because at the time, the future, everyone thought, was not in summer tent shows or not in commercial theater. Broadway and Broadway-type shows seemed to be dying, in the opinion of many theater cognoscenti and wealthy donors and other cultural movers and shakers. Just as in the sports world, there was a trend to replace traditional, musty old ballparks and football fields with enormous, sleek, new, poured concrete, multi-purpose stadiums with huge parking lots all around them, like the cavernous and largely unloved Veterans Stadium, which was also rising in South Philadelphia during those very years we're talking about today. Similarly, in the realm of high culture, there was a rush to build arts centers, huge complexes with multiple theaters and concert halls, usually in all one big enveloping shell, or gathered around a plaza with a big central fountain. The model for such art centers was, of course, Lincoln Center, where in the mid-1960s, New York City had erected a marble modernist masterpiece on the Upper West Side. Soon, Washington, D.C. was following suit, building the Kennedy Center along the Potomac. Los Angeles was creating the Mark Taper Forum, and so on. Now, clearly, the struggling Theater of the Living Arts space on South Street was not getting anywhere with its initial vision to eventually deserve a huge new art center of its own. So the question remained, where should Philadelphia build its own inevitable arts center? The answer was university campuses. Most funders were advised by administrators and newspaper editorials that the University of Pennsylvania and Temple University were expanding, and both of these campuses needed new theaters and classrooms, was the cry. So the next big theaters to be built in the city of Philadelphia were intended to house university theater programs, or to attract the kind of performing arts programming, ballet, modern dance, plays, concerts, film series that the culture classes really dug. But, as often happened, in Philadelphia, the architects and funders of these projects would make some oddly conservative choices and safe compromises with these projects. Decisions, as we shall see, that were going to have a profound effect on Philly theater productions for the next 5 decades. Now, throughout North America, theater was now a standard subject in colleges and universities, and had been, for half a century, every major educational institution had a theater department, or almost everyone. And although these theater departments were never to be supported like the athletics department, let me tell you, university boards and presidents often took particular pride in showing them off to their friends and other board members. Temple University in North Philadelphia was growing the fastest of all the major universities in the city in the 1960s. Founded as a working man's night school in the late 19th century, and then, under the leadership of Charles Ezra Burry, the brother of Joseph Burry, the guy who owned the Walnut Street Theater, remember? Temple was becoming a more traditional university by the 1920s and 30s, with big stone buildings along the east side of Broad Street above Montgomery Avenue, across from the huge bulk of the old Grand Opera House that we talked about way back in episode 30. Temple had fraternities, athletic teams, all that. Still, its tuition was quite low, and Temple's enrollment boomed during the Great Depression, as lots of ambitious young people from working-class families or lower-middle-class families strove to better their lot. And Temple now had a law school, a pharmacy school, and a teacher's college, and a huge medical school and hospital. Its ambition was to rival and surpass the University of Pennsylvania, that grand old Ivy League private university that dated all the way back to the city's colonial era. By 1955, Temple had become a semi-public institution and was shooting for an enrollment of 50,000 students. It was supported with a lot of money from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it was energetically expanding its campus footprint. This was aided, of course, by the plunging property values as the surrounding neighborhood became increasingly poor and black, as we discussed in episode 48, when we talked about the history of the Metropolitan Opera House, which is a few blocks south of Temple's campus. Though Temple had a self-image and tried to project to the public that they were a friend of the middle and working classes of the city, this expansion did nothing to enhance its reputation among the mostly black residents of North Philadelphia when, with the city's blessing, it undertook what was then called slum clearance in the blocks adjacent to its central campus, knocking down entire streets of apartments and houses along Diamond Street to build what was going to be, they thought, a new jewel of the campus, its state-of-the-art modern theater and art center. Because Temple had a theater program, too. You'll remember that Broadway director Morton DaCosta was one of its most distinguished graduates, and his mentor, Professor Pop Randall, held sway there throughout the next 4 decades. Temple put on shows in the Mitten Auditorium, often competing with basketball teams for space. But now, by the 1960s, the administration had a huge commitment of funds on hand from the wealthy Philadelphia publisher Walter Annenberg to create a school of communications, and also another grant from the Vice President Emeritus of Temple, William Tomlinson, and his wife Rebecca, to create specifically a new theater space. Overall, the budget for this huge project was over $7 million, and they wanted to create a modernist brick theater towering over an open park of green space, very different from the traditional setup of a Philadelphia block. But this was the architectural configuration that was so very typical of architecture in the modernist era. The proposed auditorium for the Tomlinson Theater would seat 481 people in 17 steeply raked rows, configured so that even the last person in the audience was still quite near to the stage. Now, this wasn't a thrust stage, though, interestingly. It was more of a modified proscenium. Sections of the audience could be closed off by moving big wall dividers to make it more intimate if required. Though I must say that in my experience, the front rows of the Tomlinsons are sort of located in awkward angles. They look up at the stage, and they rather discourage anyone at all to sit in them. There would be 5 dressing rooms, 2 of which accommodated 50 persons each, big enough for large cast student productions. And there was going to be plenty for the tech and design programs at Temple, too. 90-foot fly spaces above the stage could hold 23 rails of flats, enough for more than one show at a time. And to build these huge shows, large costume, scenery, metalwork, and carpentry shops were going to extend off the backstage area. In fact, with all the facility's modern bells and whistles, the Temple faculty was really excited about it. An orchestra pit with an hydraulic elevator that could be raised to stage level to build out the performing area. It was going to have the latest lighting and sound equipment, trap doors in the stage, sound-directing acoustic clouds over the audience, and lots of catwalks and additional light rails above. Work on the project moved swiftly, and the new theater was ready to host a trial production in the spring of 1968, before the theater was even officially opened. So, what did they decide to present in it? Well, the drama faculty at Temple was pretty traditional in their approach to teaching theater at the time, and to the modified disappointment of many students, they chose not a modern play, but a play that was cutting edge 50 years previously. The Scarecrow, it was called, an adaptation of a Nathaniel Hawthorne short story by Percy Mackay, who often staged his plays down at the Plays and Players back in the 19-teens and 20s. Now, when I saw this, I wasn't really clear why they had chosen this safe direction in the 1960s for such a new, modern space, in an era when many of their own students were now clearly more excited by the sort of repertoire and approach to theater being championed by Peter Brook, Jerzy Grotowski, and Andre Gregory. A few years ago, when I posted a question about the inaugural of Tomlinson on Facebook, a follower of the page, a man named Herb Moskowitz, chimed in to share a priceless and very 1960s stories that explained all about that production. I'll read verbatim what he wrote. I was a student at Temple when Tomlinson Theater opened. The Scarecrow was chosen because the story gave the theater department a chance to show off the latest theatrical technology that the new theater boasted, latest lighting and sound equipment, trapdoors, magical effects, etc., etc., etc. I could write a book on the experiences of the tech crew on that show. I wish I had photos, but alas, I don't. I had the good fortune to be prop master for the show. The prop list was very complex. Props needed were a Bible that an actor playing the devil could jump out of, the entire contents of a 17th century Massachusetts barn, and a scarecrow that could be built on stage and then, in full view of the audience, turn into a live actor. I still have the carved styrofoam pumpkin head used for the prop. The scarecrow was left on the stage overnight once, only lit by the ghost light. Some students brought hashish brownies to the theater and accidentally left them on the security guard's desk. When the guard came on duty, he thought the brownies were a gift to him and ate them. Later in the night, he saw the scarecrow standing center stage, and he shot it. The shots were heard, and the other security guards stormed the theater. The first guard was screaming, "He had to shoot the scarecrow. It was coming right at him." The guard was almost fired, but the students who had brought the brownies explained everything to his supervisor, and there were apparently no consequences. I moved 3 years ago, and while packing, I came across that pumpkin head. Wasn't that a great story? Unfortunately, Herb Moskowitz passed away last year and is no longer with us. I'm very happy that he honored us with that story, because how else would I learn it? It sure wasn't in the newspapers. Apparently the Temple administration had hushed it all up. So, hey, please, folks, those of you out there with long memories of your own of early years of Philadelphia theater, join in on the discussion on our Facebook page, or write us an email. Don't let these fantastic stories from your youth get lost. In October of 1968, the Tomlinson Theater, presumably with the bullet holes backstage patched, was formally dedicated in a big ribbon-cutting ceremony. William and Rebecca Tomlinson were on hand, of course, and a large full-length oil portrait of them was placed in the theater's main lobby. Then they went to watch the Temple Theater Department's production of Moliere's Tartuffe. The title character was played by South Philly native and then Temple student Albert Inarauto. Later to become famous, after he spent a stint at Yale Drama School, as the playwright of that Echt Philly coming-of-age play that would last for so many years on Broadway, Gemini. The next spring, 1969, behind the Tomlinson, a smaller black box space named the Randall Theater, after the then retiring Professor Pop Randall, was inaugurated with production of the George Abbott play, Three Men on a Horse. 56 years later, those two theaters are still there. True, both of them are now appearing a bit dated and a little shabby, but it's because they have been put to heavy use over the years. Hundreds and hundreds of Temple University students, many of whom would become well-known actors, writers, and designers in the Philadelphia theater and the larger entertainment world, would perform on or design for those spaces, including John Connolly, James Imes, Quinta Brunson, Divine Joy Randolph, Maggie Lakis, Maria Chaplin, and Coleman Domingo. And this whole Temple complex gives us a classic example of the pattern in years to come for most newly constructed performance venues in repertory theaters and universities across Philly and around the country. One large space, usually a thrust or a proscenium stage for big shows, and next to it or downstairs a smaller black box theater in which the audience and stage configuration could be modified for more intimate or experimental plays. Just a few weeks ago, by the way, Temple University announced finally that they were starting construction next spring in 2025 on a beautiful new theater and classroom complex over on the west side of North Broad Street, right on top, by the way, of an empty lot that was once occupied by headstones and graves of the enormous 19th century Monument Cemetery. Now, all the bodies have been moved, we think, say most folks with a little shudder. Well, we'll see what they find when they start digging. Anyway, to my mind, of course, this new theatrical arrival will finally put to rest the ghost of one other former longtime resident of that stretch of Broad Street, the 1888 Grand Opera House that once stood right down the block, whose last remnants disappeared only in 1988, as well as the long-gone Liberty Theater that also once stood just a little to the south nearby, where vaudevillians such as Mae West once sang and shimmied. You know, forget the buried bodies. Those are the kind of ghosts I tend to think about, and talk about all the time anyway. As I often mordantly remark to people unlucky enough to walk down any Philly street with me, I see dead theaters. At the same time that Temple was building its complex of buildings for the Annenberg School of Communications, with the Tomlinson and Randall Theaters inside in North Philadelphia, its much wealthier and more prestigious educational rival in Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania, was also using Annenberg money to rebuild its campus in West Philadelphia. I should explain at this point about the billionaire Walter Annenberg and his second wife, Lenore. They were major donors to arts organizations back then, and to theaters, and to museums, not only in Philadelphia, but all across the country. Walter Annenberg, who had only briefly attended the Wharton School of Business at Penn, inherited as a young man ownership of the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Daily Racing Form that his father, Moses Annenberg, had acquired. By the 1940s, Walter was running the show. He was continuing to run the Inquirer as a reliable conservative paper, and he folded into it the Philadelphia Daily News, a tabloid, into a larger publishing company called Triangle Communications. During the 1950s, Annenberg, spotting the direction that popular culture was going, founded 17 magazine. He also began buying up television and radio stations, not just in Philly, but across the country. His local station, WFIL, WPhil, located in West Philly, not far from the Penn campus, started the hugely popular afternoon show American Bandstand in 1952. In 1953, Annenberg bought up the small publication TV Guide and turned it into a national publishing powerhouse. For those of you that remember that period, TV Guide was a ubiquitous publication sitting on coffee tables and television consoles in almost every American household. TV Guide listed all the shows in the local area, as well as doing features on stars and producers. You could subscribe to it, or usually you'd pick it up at the supermarket aisle for just 15 cents. It bulged with ads and soon was bringing in Annenberg $1 million a week. And this was on top of all that he was raking in from his other publications and his TV stations. Annenberg had a huge mansion in the mainline suburb of Wynwood, Pennsylvania, as well as an even bigger place out in California near Palm Springs. By 1968, Walter Annenberg was 60 years old and was beginning to draw back from the day-to-day running of the businesses and all the other institutions on which he was on the board of trustees, like Temple and Penn. He was a fervent supporter of Richard Nixon for president in 1968 and was rewarded by being appointed the American ambassador to Great Britain. As Annenberg left for London, he sold the Inquirer and the Daily News to the Knight Ridder chain, and he and Lenore began liberally sharing their vast fortune and adding their names to all the institutions that they cared about. And these, of course, included the Philadelphia Performing Arts. And when his fellow Penn trustee, a guy named Harold Zellerbach, a graduate of the Wharton School of Business, who now ran the huge California lumber and paper conglomerate Crown Zellerbach Corporation, told Annenberg that he wanted to donate $500,000 to Penn for a new theater. And another prominent Penn alum, the Broadway producer and director Harold Prince, said, well, heck, he'd chip in too. Well, then the capital was suddenly there for a grand Philadelphia Center for the Arts. Just like Lincoln Center in New York, far away from tawdry old Times Square, this new $5.7 million Annenberg Center for the Arts was going to be far away from the former tawdry heart of the Philadelphia Theater District. The new action in town was going to be 2 miles to the west, across the Schuylkill River. A clean start for a clean new era. The Annenberg Center was under construction starting in '68 for the next 3 years, as the University of Pennsylvania knocked down several blocks of old brownstone buildings, expanding and modernizing its campus. The architect of the Annenberg Center was Vincent Kling, K-L-I-N-G, one of the most prominent architects in Philadelphia at the time, certainly one of the most prolific. He designed such other prominent buildings as the multiple Penn Center office towers to the west of City Hall and the brutalist United States Mint on Arch Street. He also designed, by the way, my 2 sons' high school building out in the suburbs. So I've had plenty of time to study Vincent Kling's aesthetic. Now, I'm not an architecture critic, and everything that follows is just my personal opinion. In fact, I'm going to tread a little carefully here because I have gotten my head handed to me on social media not too long ago for some unwise aspersions I cast upon the work of the sainted Philly architect Louis Kahn. You know, I really need to get someone knowledgeable, like the Pulitzer Prize-winning architectural writer Inga Saffron, onto this podcast sometime, if she would be so unwise. I mean, if she would be so kind to agree to do such a thing. But, you know, I do have long experience as a theater goer and as a theater artist, and I guess a little as a theater historian. So here's my main thought about the Annenberg Center, which, if you look at its overall plan, is a beautifully constructed series of geometric shapes that all merge into one another in a very elegant way at very interesting angles. Intellectually, aesthetically, I can see that. But theater is a public-facing activity by definition. And like a lot of mid-20th century modernist architecture, the Annenberg Center doesn't relate to the public street. And I think that's a problem. I think that should be a prime element for a theater to have. You need to physically invite people in, make a vibrant and obvious streetscape, include views of the exciting interior activity, include spaces for cafes and shops, and make the public want to walk into the entrance space. Instead, Kling's Annenberg presented a 3-story blank brick wall, stretching for hundreds of feet to passerbys on West Walnut Street, interrupted only once by a slot of dark glass entrance door that led onto the lower level. The main entrances to the complex were really on the sides, around the corner, up a series of steps and ramps, And this led you onto a grand open atrium area with warm ochre-colored carpets, an abstract sculpture, chandeliers, and a really nice box office area. And I bet that's really nice inside. The craftsmanship of the Annenberg is top quality, and the details of construction are clear and clean. The public restrooms, by the way, are really spacious and quite nice. Full marks for them. But the overall vibe in the Annenberg, to me, it's more of a 4-star hotel than the gritty and sometimes even uncomfortable and grimy details that can make a theater a vibrant place for artists to work. Ones that tie it to the surrounding community and don't hermetically seal itself off from it. Okay, so back to the historical narrative. There are two main theaters there. The showpiece is, of course, the Zellerbach Theater, which seats 960 people. It is a proscenium space, not a thrust, very wide, with classic acoustic clouds up above. The oval main orchestra seating area comes to an elegant rounded point at the lip of the stage. There's a balcony section, which completes the oval of the orchestra floor, but again, very wide. The energy coming from the performers on the stage needs to be very bright and powerful to fill up all that big oval audience space. Now, below that, downstairs in the Annenberg, there's another black box space, inevitably. This is the Harold Prince Theater, seating about 200 people on movable risers. There are other smaller theaters, rehearsal spaces, and faculty offices up on the upper level. On April 27th, 1971, the Annenberg Center finally opened. There had been some changes of leadership over that period. Richard Kirschner was the head of the whole organization at that point. President Nixon wrote a letter to send his congratulations to all of those who were present for the gala occasion. Now, naturally among the attendees at this event was Walter Annenberg himself, who had come back from the UK for the occasion. Nancy Hanks, who was then chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, was there too, and she welcomed the crowd, or rather the clump of folks in the audience. Embarrassingly, whoever was doing the publicity for that big gala opening had not really done their job. I don't know, because according to the press accounts, the auditorium of the Zellerbach was only half full. Maybe it was the choice of the play being presented, because amazingly, just as had happened at the TLA with their first production, all this new marshaled resources of American capitalism sent to fund the American theater arts had started with a play by Bertolt Brecht. And not just any Brecht play, not even a well-known one, not Galileo, not Threepenny Opera. No, they had chosen a new translation of the little-known 1928 work by Brecht called St. Joan of the Stockyards, a full-out attack on capitalism. A play which does George Bernard Shaw's Major Barbara one better by giving a title character from the Salvation Army, confronting a titan of industry, but not an arms manufacturer in this case, but rather a guy trying to corner the market in Chicago for raw meat. And the other thing interesting was that this was a completely out-of-town production. Kirschner had not even attempted to use Philadelphia theater artists or, University of Pennsylvania students for the play. Instead, he'd recruited some really top-quality and talented off-Broadway actors from New York under the direction of a New York director, Dennis Rosa. The actress Laura Esterman played the title character, called Joan Dark, and Richard Ramos was the Meat King, J. Pierpont Mauler. Neil Vipond played Mauler's henchman, Mr. Slift, leading a cast of several dozen other actors in a very large and talented ensemble. Behind them, there was a huge and complex constructivist-style set designed by Robert Mitchell, complete with moving platforms and all sorts of things. Indeed, the Annenberg Center had recruited a whole crew of experienced stagehands from the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis just to operate it. Unfortunately, reviews from the Philadelphia Press Corps were savage. Reading over them in the archives, I can see that William Collins in The Inquirer clearly didn't really care for Bertolt Brecht at all. He hated this play in particular. Though Collins was wowed by the production's scenic effects, He felt that Brecht's demonstrations of the evils of capitalism in the text were never so didactic as they were here. Newsweek magazine's regular theater critic Jack Kroll came down from New York to Philly just for the occasion, and we should note that Kroll raved about this moonshot production. He just loved it. Astounding, he termed it, and encouraged every reader to run and see it during its brief 2-week run. But Kroll did have one big criticism for the Annenberg staff. The half-empty house on opening night was, quote, one of the most shamefully inept jobs of management and public relations in the tragicomic history of culture centers, close quotes. In the Daily Pennsylvanian, the university student newspaper, the undergraduate writer Mark Rosenball allowed that, well, it was all very impressive, but he noted that this whole Annenberg Center project, as far as he could see, was adding nothing to the lives of the most natural constituents for it, the students. Penn had no drama department, after all. They had thought about forming one in the 1920s, but they decided not to. And there were no plans to form one now. As Rosenball wrote, quote, all the official inaugural production of the Annenberg Center for the Performing Arts and St. Joan of the Stockyards serves to demonstrate is that much can be done with the resources of the center, especially if they are utilized by those who are most competent to do so, i.e. the professionals who produce St. Joan, and for whom the center was basically intended. The truth was that despite all this planning, no one really seemed to know what to do now with the shiny new complex. The administrator's plans for the center were a bit vague, honestly. Maybe book some big-name singers, dance companies. And, perhaps at the time they were looking at the sad remains of the TLA across town. And Richard Kirshner, the leader of the center, had explicitly rejected himself ever forming a resident repertory company for the Annenberg. That was right out. So, again, nothing was going to be invested in the building for a long-term future for the local art scene, and nothing was going to be invested that really developed or drew upon the talents of Penn students. They had their own undergraduate theater clubs, like the Mask and Wig, after all. They could go play over there. The Annenberg was to exist on the Penn campus as a cultural resource, but really only for the middle-class suburban audience whom its programming was meant to appeal to. Students could come and watch it too, of course, if they wanted. But even 2 years later, I note in an article by Stephen Wynn in the Daily Pennsylvanian from February of 1973, the sort of anti-Annenberg Center sentiment amongst Penn undergraduates had not changed. As Wynn wrote, quote, what remains clear is that Penn's Annenberg Center has philosophically directed itself away from the student as a member of the artistic community and branded him as a consumer. Which brings us to the third Philadelphia theater built during this era, the Walnut Street Theater. Now, I know we have documented continually on this podcast that some form of the building of the Walnut Street Theater had existed on the corner of 9th and Walnut for a long time. But we know that most of the old fabric of the original building was dismantled and discarded in 1920. And I'm here to tell you that the Walnut Street Theater, in the physical form it has today, really dates from the early 1970s. And the fact that anything still exists at all is due to another philanthropic family, not the Annenbergs and not the Schuberts, because you may remember that there was some sentiment among them for pulling the old place down entirely. But instead, it was the Haas family, who had earned their fortune from Philadelphia's enormous Rohm and Haas Chemical Corporation, who saved the day. The Haas Family Foundation, along with others in the Philadelphia philanthropic community, really saved the Walnut, and it was they who were to be the philanthropic wellspring of the revival and growth of the Philadelphia theater community from that point onward, down to the present day. Anyway, for our purposes today, at long last, the Schubert family's ownership of the Walnut was coming to an end, and it too was about to become an arts center. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to read here from Andrew Davis's great book about the Walnut Street Theater entitled America's Longest Run, published by the Pennsylvania State University Press in 2010. This is how Davis describes the transition that took place between the years 1968 and 1970 in sections of the book entitled The Shubert's Last Season and then one entitled Restoration. The Shubert organization was approached by a consortium of local civic leaders about turning the Walnut into a performing arts center. Advertising executive Philip Klein spearheaded the project. Money was provided by the Haas Community Fund. At an annual meeting on May 26, 1969, the Haas Community Fund endorsed the idea of a new theatrical venture to be located at the Walnut and provided a grant of $2 million for the purchase and renovation of the theater. It further authorized the establishment of the Walnut Street Theater Corporation, a nonprofit cultural and educational organization to preserve and operate the theater. Philip Klein was named president. In June 1969, the new corporation purchased the Walnut from the Shubert-controlled Select Theater Corporation for $300,000. The signing ceremony took place on Monday, June 9, 1969. Lawrence Shubert Lawrence Jr. represented the Shubert organization. The signing was to take place on the stage, but the stagehands union viewed that as a performance, which required the presence of paid union personnel. So the ceremony was instead moved to the lobby. With that, the Walnut Street Theater entered a new era as a community-oriented performing arts center. The goal was to restore the Walnut to its 19th century grandeur so it could serve as an example of theater of the early American period and to recognize Philadelphia's place in the history of the American stage. The Haas Community Fund allocated $2 million for the restoration. The architectural firm of Dickey, Weissman, Chandler, and Holt, which specializes in architectural renovations, was hired to oversee the project. John M. Dickey, a partner in the firm and a longtime advocate of historic preservation, oversaw the exterior renovations, while F. Brian Loving, a specialist in theater design, took charge of the interior. On February 2, 1970, the Walnut Street Theater Corporation purchased the 6-story building next to the theater. This 25-foot wide building at 825 Walnut would house the box office and business offices on the ground floor, with additional office and rehearsal space on the upper floors. The new entrance to the theater would be 825 Walnut. Philip Klein supervised the project. He was assisted by 24-year-old Randy Swartz, who was hired as the publicist. The exterior required relatively minor changes to restore the facade to John Haviland's 1828 designs. Marble columns, which had been embedded into the wall of the theater, were freed, and steel supports were inserted into the masonry. The arched windows of the second floor were enlarged. The marble facing on the Walnut Street side of the theater was replaced. Because the marble of the original quarry had been depleted, gray marble had to be imported from Italy. The old doors at the front of the theater, which were designed to fold, were replaced by modern glass double doors. New alcoves for gas lamps were put in, and new lamps were built to resemble those in early pictures of the theater. The steps leading up to the theater were restored, and the floor of the lobby was raised to accommodate them. Given the impossibility of restoring the theater to its 19th century design, the architects decided to make the Walnut an up-to-date arts center. Randy Swartz visited performing arts centers around the country and came back with ideas that could be incorporated into the new design. His research resulted in such innovative ideas as closed-circuit television system that would allow latecomers to see what was happening on stage, a double set of doors to prevent light from seeping into the auditorium, pedestal seats that afforded extra legroom. The auditorium was finished off in a modernist style that the architects felt preserved the spirit of the Greek Revival architecture of Haviland's original design. The walls, ceiling, and balcony of the auditorium were sand-finished plaster, with smoothly sweeping lines joining the balcony to the walls. The house was fully air-conditioned, and state-of-the-art lighting system was installed, featuring a computerized lighting board that allowed changes for up to 7 scenes to be set in advance. The wooden stage of the Walnut was completely rebuilt. It was given a vinyl finish and equipped with 23 traps. 3 floors of dressing rooms were installed, including 1 star suite and 2 chorus rooms, which could accommodate up to 20 performers. The renovation costs far exceeded projections. The Haas Community Fund eventually provided more than $4 million, reflecting its commitment to creating a modern, all-purpose facility that would cater to all the arts. All right, so now it was 3 years later, October 16th, 1971. After a 2-year reconstruction and restoration project, the historic Walnut Street Theater was once again open to the public. Just like the Annenbergs, the Haasses also wanted to have a gala opening. Marlene Dietrich had originally been scheduled to appear for the occasion, but she had bowed out from performing at the gala event for reasons that were unclear. So instead, another movie star of the bygone era, Lillian Gish, was the first performer to inaugurate the space. There was no show, so instead the entire space was open for public inspection on the 16th. The crowd all entered through the Walnut's new entrance, the foyer at the base of the adjacent office building, and according to an article, once again by William Collins of the Inquirer, an invited crowd of nearly 1,000 friends and patrons participated in an unusual walkthrough to see what loving hands and close to $3 million had wrought on the showplace at 9th and Walnut Streets, which was first opened in 1809 as an indoor circus. What they saw was an impressively handsome job of restoration on the outside and a marvel of reconstruction on the inside. During the informal kickoff ceremony on the stage, a surprise appearance was made by Lillian Gish, the silent film star whose film lecture on the Days of the Silence will be one of the weekend's opening attractions on Sunday night. Miss Gish asked, "All the ghosts of the past, perhaps they're here tonight to bless this theater." Mrs. F. Otto Haas, Vice President of the Theater Corporation, gave a message of thanks to everyone who had worked to make the renovation a reality. And she concluded, "What happens to the Walnut Street Theater is now up to the people of Philadelphia." So there we are. What was different about this project, to my mind, although, in essence, it too was now a mid-century art center, but instead of avoiding the community life and the life on the street, it welcomed it. Its old facade proudly advertised and announced its existence and purpose. This, I think, is why the Walnut is still regarded, even today, with affection and considerable civic pride in Philadelphia, as it has been for 2 centuries, in a way that the Annenberg and the Tomlinson Theater just never really would be or ever, could be. We will continue with the story of the Walnut Street Theater and the Annenberg Center when we tell the story of the Philadelphia Drama Guild in the 1970s and 80s. Now that will be in January of 2025, and I've got a great number of interviews and shows lined up for you good folks for the next few months. Until then, have a wonderful holiday season. There's no Adventures in Theater History holiday show this year, but I promise to give you all a New Year's Day treat with a special encore episode from our archive of previous shows. Oh, and I should mention that not only has the Walnut Street Theater recently undergone a fresh renovation, but that the Annenberg Center has announced plans, too, for a rebuilding of its structure. From what I can tell, from what they're posting on the website, they're going to strip away a lot of those brick walls, install a lot of glass, and open the lobby area up to the community and the street, and add another venue that really ties it to the Penn campus and to the students there. It looks fantastic. So, as Philadelphia's own group, McFadden and Whitehead, remind us, There's no stopping us now, folks. We are well and truly launched on this saga of modern Philadelphia theater. I will see you all again in the new year. Keep the faith and keep your courage up. It's likely that we're all going to need it. Meanwhile, if you haven't gotten a copy already, look for Adventures in Theater History Philadelphia, the book. Go ask for it now at your local independent bookstore or order it online, wherever fine books are sold. If you enjoy it, remember to leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads so that other good folks can learn about it too. You can also support us on Patreon. The links are in the show notes. Or leave a review about the show on Apple Podcasts. And, as I should add, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, or Blue Sky. Our email is aithpodcast@gmail.com. Write us and let us know what you think. Or, like the great Herb Moskowitz, share a special story from Philadelphia theater history, one that I may not know, but that needs to be heard. There is, or there will be soon, anyway, a blog post for this episode on our website, www.aithpodcast.com, with images of all the theaters that we've talked about today. Thank you for listening to us throughout the year 2024 and for looking forward with us to the year 2025. And thanks, as always, for joining us on yet another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.